Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I just wanted to give you guys an example from one of my tracks of how I have used different panning techniques and all that to achieve a nice full sound. And hopefully this video will kind of help give you an idea of how all these different techniques and tools and elements can work together to produce a nice full stereo width in your mix, and keep things sounding pretty clean and pretty full. So this is the loop that I will be taking a look at in this video. So you can hear it has a pretty nice full stereo sound to it. And so I'm going to look at each element and explain what I did and why I did to help give each element its own stereo width and help give the overall sound a nice stereo width. So I'm going to start off bringing things in one at a time. And the first sound I'm going to look at is the kick. And if you look at the vector scope and listen to the kick, you'll hear that it is very much mono, especially if I turn the reverb off. And all of these sounds do have a bit of reverb added, just to help glue them together and add a little bit of stereo width to some of the sounds that didn't really have any stereo width. But it's mostly to glue things together and produce a decent atmosphere. So the kick I kept nice and centered and completely mono because I wanted it to be punchy. And this is a pretty busy loop. There's a lot of different drum sounds going on. And keeping that kick mono just helped give it its own space and leave room for other sounds. So the kick is kept mono. Now the kick, one thing I forgot to mention is it did have some stereo width to it. So what I did was I merged it completely to mono. And then I also have a second kick and a snare. So the snare has a decent width to it, but the kick it is layered with is completely mono. So I wanted the snare to be kind of fat and have a decent stereo width to it, while keeping the kick mono. And so you can hear that it sounds like this. And the snare has that stereo width because that's just how it was as the sample originally. So next up in the drum beat, I have this offbeat hit sound, and it's a layer of a few different elements. It's this snare, which I kept mono. It's this ride cymbal, which I kept mono, except I added more reverb onto it to give it a little bit of stereo width. And then it's this clap. And so, all these sounds are mostly centered, and that's because they still make up, the real foundation of the beat. And I wanted to keep that foundation centered so it would have, a nice power behind it to just help enforce that rhythm. And then there is one final sound that kind of adds to that main rhythm. It's not as important, but I did keep it centered as well. And the reason I kept it centered was I didn't really have anything to match it with that I might pan opposite of it. So I might have panned it in a different case, but in this case I kept it centered. So you can hear that the big foundation of this beat is all pretty much mono and centered. The only thing that has a nice stereo width to it is the snare, but it still remains centered. So there isn't really a nice wide stereo width yet. But I did add some more rhythmic layers to help that happen. And that is where these sounds come in. So you can hear that when I add both of these sounds into the mix, they add a nice rhythm to the sound. And they kind of play off of each other if you listen closely to them. And so I ended up panning them opposite of each other. You can hear this sound is panned to the left, and this one is to the right. And they're panned the same amount, just opposite each other. And I think maybe I should have panned them a little bit more than I did. I kind of rushed this mix, but the point is I panned them opposite each other because they are similar sounds, and they are part of their own additional rhythm to this drum track. And then this is the third part of that additional rhythm, which is a low kind of a similar sound, a similar percussion sound that plays in the lower frequencies more. And this one, you can hear it has a nice stereo width to it. And the stereo width from the sound is just already in that sample. You can see that I'm not spreading it any more. I haven't panned it, and there's no stereo enhancing effects on the mixer track. So that's just how that sample was from the sample pack. And I kept that stereo width because I had so many things that had such little stereo width in the main beat that I figured, this additional beat should have a lot more stereo width to it. So I could have converted it to mono if the situation was different, but I kept it nice and wide because I thought it sounded good. And it also helped it to stand out a little bit when these other sounds were all playing. And so as another part of this rhythm, I have this sound here. And you can hear that it is panned to the right. And because of that, I have this extra shaker here that is panned to the left. And you can hear that it just plays on every beat. And because I had this kind of high frequency sound panned right, and this one panned left, I have these other shakers that have a pretty fast pattern. And I kept them centered. So that way I had one high-pitched percussive instrument in the center, and then I had one out to the left and one out to the right. It just helped open up the mix and keep those high-end sounds having their own space. And this sound here is just kind of a little extra sound, to add a little bit of spice to the drum beat or whatever. And it hits with the snare towards the end of this loop. So you could hear that it just had this nice sound towards the end. And the sound is quite wide. You should hear it has a pretty good stereo width to it. And, I just thought that that little extra sound with that really nice stereo width helps fill out that drum beat a little bit more. And the stereo width in this sample is just a part of the sample from the sample pack. You can see on the mixer track here, I'm not spreading it anymore. There aren't any stereo enhancing effects or anything. So I just thought it sounded good as it was in terms of the stereo width. And, that just kind of added some extra width to the sound and a little bit of spice. And so that is all of the drums. And like I said, I rushed this mix a little bit, so I think I might have actually made this shaker sound a bit louder to help it, balance out this one a little bit better. And I might have even panned those more and probably would have panned these a bit more as well, just to make that stereo width wider. But next up I have a couple instruments, and this is a brass section. And you can hear that the brass section is pretty wide. And part of that is because I wanted it to sound, further to the back of the mix. But also because it plays at the same time as the kick. And the kick is completely mono, but with that really nice brass layer, it helps make the sound a lot bigger. So if you listen to just the kick, it doesn't sound as huge as with that really wide brass over the top of it. So I definitely wanted that brass to be nice and wide. And the brass sound, it had some stereo to it already. So I didn't use any kind of effect to add any stereo to it. But you can see that I did use the spread knob, and I spreaded it a lot. So originally it sounded like this. And let me turn the reverb off real quick. And you can hear that it's just, quite thin compared to if I spread it all the way. And I really wanted it to be wide, so I did spread it all the way, and it just sounds better with that kick. It just really widens up that whole sound. So that's why I, used that spread knob and set it to 100% spreaded. And then the last sound I have is a wobble bass. And the bass is made up of 3 different layers. The first is a sub-bass layer. And you can hear that the sub-bass layer is kept completely mono. And there's not even any reverb on it. But that's because I layer it with a nice wide stereo bass. Which is, it has 2 parts. It has the fat wobble and the high pitched wobble. And you can hear that the fat wobble has a nice stereo width to it. But the high wobble bass is a bit wider. And you can see in the mixer, I spread the high pitched one more than I spread the mid-ranged fat wobble. And so When you layer all of them together, it sounds pretty cool. Because the sub bass holds down the center of that sound. And the fat wobble is pretty wide and gives a nice wide sound to it. But then the high-pitched one is even wider, and where the amount of width on the high-pitched one might have sounded weird if it were done to that mid-range wobble, it kind of widens that sound up even more. And the stereo width on the fat wobble bass. You can see there aren't any stereo effects in the track. It's not spread at all. And so it's just achieved by using unison on the synthesizer. And you can hear if I turn that off, it gets mono. So the stereo width here is just achieved by that unison. And the same is the case for that high-pitched wobble as well. It has the same unison settings. But I did use that spread knob to spread it a little bit extra. So, this is just one example of how I have kind of used panning and different decisions for stereo widths in a track. To really help a busy drum beat sound acceptable in the mix and have it sound nice and wide and full and all that. So in this track, I didn't really use any phasers or chorus or the Haas effect or anything like that because, I was just really able to achieve a nice wide stereo width without having to use those tools and techniques. A lot of the sounds that I wanted stereo were already stereo from the sound design stage, like the brass section. And the snare as well. And that wobble bass. So I didn't really have to use anything special to achieve a nice decent stereo width. But, definitely in other cases I do, and you will definitely have to in certain cases. So hopefully this has helped to give you an idea of, the different things you can do and, certain ways that you might think about the panning and stereo width decisions that you use while mixing.